The goal is to make people skeptical of public institutions, K-12, universities, right? Because the end goal is to privatize those things. The end goal is to get greater donor control over the university. If all of a sudden everybody around the country are talking about one thing for no apparent reason, then there's probably something at work here, right? That it's a part of an organized backlash. You know, who are the actors, right? What are the groups? What are the names of the individuals? Who do those individuals have connections to, right? What are the groups? Who's funding the groups?
Welcome to another episode of Just Talks. I'm Allie Collins, a 25-year educator, community organizer, and mom. In the first series of this podcast, I'm talking with researchers, educators, and community activists about attacks on social justice education that we are seeing nationally. These attacks are happening at all levels: higher ed, school boards, superintendents, principals, and even teachers. My goal in this series is to begin to connect the dots so that regular folks can help push back on the disinformation we're seeing and to get involved in defending progress in our education system. In the first episode, I talked with Dr. Walter Grayson, who helped set the larger historical framework for these attacks, which share connections to the January 6th insurrection and even before to the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. In this episode, the second in the series, I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Isaac Kamola, an associate professor at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. Professor Kamola's teaching and research interests focus on the political economy of higher education, African anti-colonial theory, and critical globalization studies. I like the term political economy because, as you will learn from our interview, his recent work has focused on understanding the production and consumption of political ideas and the resulting impacts on our democracy. His latest book project, Free Speech and Koch Money, Manufacturing a Campus Culture War, examines the dark money behind the so-called campus free speech crisis. I wanted to talk with Professor Kamola because he has done extensive research on attacks on educators at the higher ed level. In fact, I became aware of his work after stumbling on an article he wrote in the Journal of Academic Freedom titled, "Dear Administrators, to protect your faculty from right-wing attacks, follow the money." With that in mind, I wanted to share an excerpt from that article. It states, "Over the past few years, American higher education has endured a rash of high-profile, seemingly spontaneous, social media-driven firestorms. However, if one examines the details in each case, clear patterns emerge. Most attacks are leveled against faculty of color or those whose research and teaching focuses on issues of race. Most start with a handful of organizations explicitly created to monitor and intimidate college faculty, most prominently Campus Reform and the College Fix. From there, they travel to sympathetic right-wing websites and news outlets, also created by activist donors committed to undermining public institutions before arriving at Fox News. Most attacks that gain traction involve college administrations sanctioning faculty and condemning their speech." With that in mind, and without any further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Isaac Kamola and our interview. Enjoy. You have been doing a lot of research on these attacks on higher education, but this past year we've been seeing a real explosion of attacks against educators at the K-12 level, at all levels, with a specific focus on anti-racist education or diversity and inclusion. And then also we've seen attacks on LGBTQ, inclusive education, and trans students. So, I just want to give you the opportunity to jump in and tell me, what have you been seeing? Tell me a little bit about your work, and then a little bit about how now it seems really relevant to what we're seeing right now in the United States on these attacks on school boards and also school, educators and policies.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. So in our book, Free Speech and Koch Money, my co-author and I, Ralph Wilson, we examine what we call the campus free speech crisis and how that got manufactured. So we look at, in 2017, there was a series of very high-profile campus skirmishes, culture war skirmishes around Milo Yiannopoulos, Ben Shapiro, Charles Murray coming to campus, being protested. Those protests were condemned by by administrators, by politicians, who then passed a series of campus free speech bills that basically curtailed students' ability to protest speakers, right? So if an objectionable student, if a racist, if a white nationalist, if a groyper, or some other person that is, anti-academic, not interested in the pursuit of knowledge, but is a partisan, right? If they came to campus, the end result of that trajectory was that students would have fewer means and fewer resources for protesting that students, and in many states face expulsion and being sued. So basically, what we argued is that this arc of these flashpoints of kind of campus protest existed within a broader kind of political strategy. And we date that strategy back to the 1970s, where Charles Koch and others began to be really concerned about desegregation, and also wanted to, and worried about the criticisms of their extremist version of free market capitalism, their kind of anarcho-capitalist ideas, right? Any sort of criticisms of those kinds of completely unregulated capitalism, they saw as a threat, and they saw universities as an essential place to basically insist that these ideas be taken seriously. But there's a kind of a creature of the right-wing think tank world called Christopher Rufo, who's basically trying to design a political weapon that can then advance political agendas, which include, for example, the privatization of K-12 education, right? So thinking about what do you need? Parents generally like the schools that their kids go to, but you want to privatize those schools, right? That parents generally like. How do you do that? Well, you have to find a mechanism so parents begin to see their teachers, their kids' teachers, and the kids' schools as the enemy. What kind of thing do you need to do that? Well, what Chris Rufo looked around, and he basically said, critical race theory. Everybody hates things that are critical. They hate talking about race, and they hate theory, right? You link those two things together, you have what he calls the perfect weapon, direct quote, right? And he saw it explicitly as a part of a political strategy, right? So now you have this political weapon, but then you also have an infrastructure, and you're able to push that weapon out into this infrastructure. So in unison, right, you have academics on college campuses, in Koch think tanks, talking about the threats of critical race theory. You have all of these like policy documents and at Heritage and Cato talking about the horrors of critical race theory, right? You read those documents by Heritage and they're laughable. It's clear that people don't even understand what they're talking about. They have no knowledge whatsoever of what they're talking about, right? They're based on all kinds of assumptions that is based on not academic debates, but just kind of pure opinion, right? And gross misreadings and lack of understanding, right? And then you also have these legislatures, like in Florida, passing laws that are dictating what teachers can teach, right? So again, you have the goal is to make people skeptical of public institutions, K-12 universities, right? Because the end goal is to privatize those things. The end goal is to get greater donor control over the university. The peer-reviewed research is saying that climate change is man-made. And the fossil fuel execs say, we don't like that finding. We prefer to hear the other side, in which climate change is not a problem, but the science, the peer-reviewed science, is saying it is a problem. Then what you want to replace academic scholarship with is privately funded free speech, right? Where those donors, in a free marketplace of ideas, where a marketplace is understood as a radical libertarian, completely unregulated free-for-all, those with the most money will then generate the outcomes of what these institutions are researching. Likewise, K-12 education will become a private commodity bought and sold on a market, et cetera, right? So what happens is all of a sudden we're talking about critical race theory, right? As if it's this thing that we have to be worried about, right? In fact, it's actually an imagined boogeyman, that is then infused into this structure, this political infrastructure that's designed to yield political outcomes, right? And then the thing that's so brilliant about this political structure is that it seems like it's isolated, right? So it seems like there's a think tank over here talking about critical race theory, and then Breitbart over here is talking about critical race theory, and then Campus Reform over here is writing articles about critical. And there's all this kind of milieu, and then all of a sudden there's these parents that are showing up at school board meetings talking about critical race theory, not taking into account the fact that all of these things are deeply networked and connected.
So how do we deal with this, right? We have this phenomena going on. We're seeing it nationally, but tell me an example of, how this plays out on a real personal level.
So for example, I was talking with a faculty member who had a trans student in class. And in conversation with that trans student, learned that it would be really helpful to that student if they use pronouns, proper pronouns. And so the teacher decided to do that, and to kind of, as a kind of like pedagogical way to enforce that, kind of started misgendering students, right? So people who refuse to use the proper pronouns of this trans student, that teacher would misgender the cis student. That got leaked to Campus Reform, or maybe it was College Fix, I forget which one, right? And then from there, these organizations, Campus Reform and College Fix, are paid by political organizations, dark money, right? They pay students to basically write outrage pieces about universities and about faculties. Like, can you believe this teacher is doing this? Can you believe this university is doing that? Those outrage stories then get injected into the right-wing media ecosystem, right? Where they circle around, right? And they get picked up by other stories. So for example, Campus Reform works very closely with Fox News. So stories that start at Campus Reform can go very quickly to Fox News, right? They go very quickly to Breitbart, Daily Wire, Daily Caller, any number of these places. And then also into kind of more chat rooms and viral spaces. We've noticed that there's actually kind of a lot of stories end up on like message boards around college sports teams that tend to be like fairly misogynistic and racist spaces. And then in those contexts, that can lead to a lot of hate mail and attacks. So this particular professor got completely bombarded with hate mail, right? And then had to end up fleeing their house for fear of their personal safety, right? And then also there's this gaslighting effect where professors think they said something wrong, right? That there was a mistaken judgment. In 2020, we found that of faculty members written about by Campus Reform, 3 faculty members were fired as a result of these stories, right? Because administrations don't stand up. There's a lot of pressure on them, and all of a sudden, like it's this phenomenon that happens where all of a sudden you're in this middle of a hurricane. Like it's a beautiful sunny day, and then all of a sudden this hurricane comes out of nowhere, and people take it, assume that means that there's something there, right? That there is a problem, that something wrong was said, right? That something amiss is.
So something must be wrong, or this wouldn't be happening.
Exactly.
And so then we're seeing this happen now at the K-12 level, right? I've been following national Twitter. There's superintendents who've been told they have to resign for saying Black Lives Matter. And I'm even hearing about this now on a classroom level, right? Where an individual student might videotape a teacher talking about the insurrection, and then it ends up on Fox News. How do people respond, or what are some cases where people can respond? Because it's understandable people would just be overwhelmed and want to, it's kind of fight or flight. You just lock down. But I'm assuming without an appropriate response, it can get worse, is what you're saying.
Right, exactly. So what the first thing that one should do, I think, is if there is something that just seems out of place, right? If all of a sudden everybody around the country are talking about one thing for no apparent reason, then there's probably something at work here, right? That it's a part of an organized backlash, right? And I think that you see this at the kind of like the mobbing of school board meetings, I think is a perfect example. It appears like all of a sudden there's these parents that are coming out to school board meetings to talk about the evils of critical race theory, right? But if you look at the main groups that are behind those school board meetings, right? One of them is Parents Defending Education, right? Parents Defending Education is run by Nicole Neely, and Nicole Neely, prior to that was the lead of this organization called Speech First. Speech First was an AstroTurf legal group that got a large amount of dark money donations to file lawsuits around campus free speech issues. Right? She's now working on the kinds of bringing parents out to school boards. Likewise, the group Building Education for Students Together, BEST, is straight up FreedomWorks, right? If you sign up for their webinars, it'll tell you that is being put on by FreedomWorks. And FreedomWorks is one of these large like AstroTurf groups run by Koch brothers, and Koch-donor network is funded by these kind of plutocratic libertarians that are, and so you have what looks like this spontaneous uprising, right? But actually there's this deep networked, and mobilized, like these organizations like Freedom Work have statewide offices and full-time organizers and full-time staff whose job it is to get people out to these meetings, right? They have trainings. They have a bus tour. BEST has a bus tour, and they go around and they train parents about how to participate in school board meetings and stuff like that. Like I'm all for being a good activist, right? And like organizing and getting people out and mobilizing, right? But I think it's really important to draw that distinction between, if there's a group of parents in a school board in a district that are really concerned about an issue and are doing the work to like push on that issue, that's entirely different from a kind of a manufactured group that is basically providing students or providing parents with like a pre-packaged argument, a pre-packaged strategy, marching orders, right? And then is taking those stories and putting them straight to Fox News and other media, right? Because like stuff happens in school board meetings all the time. Very rarely does it become national news.
When you see stuff that's like over and over and over again, and you're seeing it in especially like Fox News, Tucker Carlson, Breitbart, InfoWars, all of those venues, and it's all at the same time. Like it's not organic. Basically.
It's not organic. Yeah. Okay. So in a way, if you see something that's not a story become a national story, then that's not organic, right? Okay. Like an assignment that a professor teaches in their first year seminar at a small state school in Central Texas, right, is not a national story. I mean, people on campus and people regionally can be upset about like this particular thing. And that happens all the time, and it should. Like there should be ongoing debates and discussions about these kinds of issues, right? But it's not a national news story. Right. And when you see that happen, and you see it happen over and over again, then you know that there's an infrastructure behind creating a certain narrative, right? So you see these kinds of things that all of a sudden come from nowhere.
It's so big, right? Yeah. How can I respond in a way that's productive or helpful?
The strategy for social change works when it's secret, right? And it becomes incredibly more costly when you have to justify it, right? If people see, oh my gosh, there's this spontaneous uprising in these school boards, this must be an issue, we have to take this seriously, right? Then for a very, very little amount of money, right, these groups are able to drive a national narrative. Follow the money, right? If you're following the money and you're making the infrastructure the story, right, then all of a sudden oh my God, there's this crazy curriculum, they're teaching these crazy books at my kid's school, this is so outrageous, they got to do something about it. Right? If it becomes, well, this is, FreedomWorks that's bringing in a bunch of staffers to make this look like, a big issue, and that becomes part of the story, then that becomes less effective. I've created what's called a customized search engine. It's a simple Google tool that I've totally recommend to everybody, where I've just basically took about 15, 20 of the kind of most prominent Koch-funded, Koch-donor network, think tanks, and whatnot. And then you can I put them in that search engine. And so you can then enter things that, there's a speaker that's coming to talk about CRT at your school district. right? You could put in that speaker's name and see what other connections they have, right?
Okay.
And you can kind of
So you can
begin
start to see this hidden infrastructure or this hidden network using that tool.
yeah, who are the actors, right? What are the groups? What are the names of the individuals? Who do those individuals have connections to, right? What are the groups? Who's funding the groups? All of that stuff can be pretty tricky to find, right? Um, there's a number of really great resources. Um, DSmog blog is really great. SourceWatch is really great. Two places that kind of are aggregators of information about different think tanks and organizations and stuff like that. So imagine if BEST brings a bunch of parents to a school board, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're making all these claims about critical race theory, blah, 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 critical race theory, right? And that school board member just looks back at them and says, critical race theory is a manufactured strategy created by the Manhattan Institute, and BEST is funded by FreedomWorks, right? I do not trust these opinions as meriting any attention whatsoever.
Right.
That would be fundamentally different than, oh my God, there's a bunch of angry parents in this room. We have to listen to it. As long as that's the strategy, that strategy and the infrastructure becomes the story, then the impact of what they hope the story will become, critical race theory is this terrible thing that's destroying America, that then stops having the kinds of legitimacy, types of power.
Right.
And
so the media also plays a part, right? You're saying that it's about the story, right? So if the story is about the outrage, they win. But if the story is about the infrastructure or the folks behind the infrastructure, that's what we should be talking about. Campus reform is propaganda. It's funded, but it does have impact. We have this infrastructure in place. Do you have any thoughts on, how do we counterbalance that?
Yeah. So in the conclusion to our book, we give an example of an inside higher education piece about free speech on campus, right? And in that piece, we just go through who is cited, right? The experts that are cited in that piece, the organizations that they're a part of, and just demonstrate that everybody that journalist references, with one exception, right, is within this broad kind of political infrastructure. A few days ago, there was an article published at the Chronicle of Higher Education about a faculty who was defending a colleague who had what sounded like an amazing assignment about whiteness in class, and got a lot of criticism for that. And he was facing backlash for calling out the student for releasing that assignment in violation of the honor code, right? And the Chronicle of Higher Education wrote a really nice article about that incident. But what their analysis did is like, he said this, she said that, this student did that, this is the honor code, right? And so I responded on Twitter saying, no, look at what's going on. Here is the journalist who wrote this story, right? Here's her other stories and the sources that she uses. They're all from Turning Points USA and Speech First and other organizations, right? Here is, the network in which campus reform operates, and here's the story that they want to convince us is true, right? That that professors that teach about whiteness are somehow like crazy and somehow deviant. When nothing becomes a story that everybody is talking about, then is not the nothing that you need to talk about, right? It's the infrastructure that makes that nothing into a story, right? So there's a lot of emphasis is placed on keeping these groups as secret. That's because they're more effective when they are secret. Following the money, drawing those connections, and to also just know enough about the broader network to be comfortable and confident that that's what's going on. And I'd recommend for your viewers to really do this kind of work, because it's really empowering, right? Because I think that there's a sense that like American politics is spiraling out of control. There's all of these terrible bills that are being passed in all kinds of ways that are having terrible effects on education and on human beings, right? And it can just seem like, oh my gosh, this stuff is happening and we're not in control of it. But I think it's really powerful to say, no. This isn't just a force of nature that's happening. These are actually political operatives who are really well networked, really savvy, and incredibly well funded, and they're making these things happen. Okay, that sucks. But if you understand it that way, right, not as this kind of natural force of doom that's doing terrible stuff, but it's like, no, there's a political machinery at work. Then we can start to say, how do we sabotage that machinery, right? How do we undermine the ability for that machine to operate effectively, right? And then, then it becomes a little bit more of an equal fight. That's really an empowering project, but we need to not get stuck in the weeds and debate amongst each shelf, or take these stories, take these nothings as things that are actually need to be taken as seriously. It's a really empowering to kind of focus on this structure and see it as something that's beatable.
Tell us the name of your book again, where we can get it. And then also, is there anything else that we should be reading, either by you or by people that you are reading?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book that I wrote with Ralph Wilson is called Free Speech and Koch Money, Manufacturing a Campus Culture War. It's by Pluto Press. If you go to the Pluto Press website and type in Koch 30 as a promo code, you get 30% off. I think that's still the case, right? Two absolutely essential books that I would recommend, of course, is Jane Mayer's Dark Money, which is kind of a canonical text about the major kind of plutocratic libertarian figures and the kinds of political machinery that they put together. It really nicely goes into the ways that they're networked, but also the differences among those groups. Read everything you can by Jane Mayer. She's absolutely incredible. And then also Ann Nelson, I believe, is the author. I'm dyslexic, so I sometimes get names wrong. I apologize, but it has an amazing book called Shadow Network. And what the Shadow Network, what that book looks at is the Council for National Policy. Basically, the Council for National Policy is a group that brings together the libertarians with the right-wing media, the Rush Limbaughs, and the conservative Christians, right? And Christian and nationalists. And they meet on a regular basis, and they have secret, well-funded meetings in which they lay out their strategy, right? So it was at meetings like this that critical race theory became something that they're like, okay, this is what we're focusing on now. This is our 2022 electoral strategy, right? And so that book, I think, is amazingly well researched, and I think that it's also just demonstrates like how powerful this group is, and also kind of how pathetic it is, in terms of the people who are part of it. And it's a pretty unsavory, I think, group of people. But and then also, if you want to kind of do some I mentioned them before, but Source Watch and DSmog blog are two great places. If you're just like, what is Turning Points? Go to DSmog, type in Turning Points. It gives a really nice list, as well as resources about who funds these organizations, who's on the board, hyperlinked to stories about those individuals. And DSmog is particularly good in looking at kind of how this plays out in climate policy, but drawing climate denial within this broader network strategy of disinformation and network propaganda. It's an amazing resource.
Thank you so much for your time. And if it's okay, I want to do a screenshot. 1, 2, 3. Great. Thank you.
Awesome.
And so I really appreciate you, and I'm going to keep reading your work, and I really appreciate you in every interview as well, and all the resources that you're provided. And I will make sure to put those in the description of this video, and then also make those available for folks. So thank you again for taking the time to talk, and thanks for all of your work.
Yeah, and thank you. This is going to be such a valuable resource to have these videos and the resources all put together. Thanks so much for doing that. And it's really a pleasure to have met you through this struggle, and I look forward to keep collaborating on in the future.
Thank you. Yeah, and I do feel like what you said, this idea that we can't always control things that are happening. There are these forces at work, but I think the one thing that I've found is you end up finding community among folks you didn't know existed, right? Other people see the same things, and then you reach out, and I'm sure, you have a network of folks that are also, as you started writing about it, you started connecting with people. And so I love this idea of building a network of folks at a variety of different levels, right? We have different perspectives to help inform how we can, as just good citizens, right? Fight for a multiracial democracy that we all envision and believe in. And like I said, I really appreciate your generosity, the work that you're doing to help folks, the toolkits. It's very actionable, and just making yourself available to me. And I'm sure many people who are reaching out and seeing some of the same things that you're seeing.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you.
Great.
If you're an anti-racist educator like me, you know there's a war going on in our country, and it's happening via our public education system. Unfortunately, many people don't know there's a man behind the book bans and anti-CRT and anti-LGBTQ legislation sweeping across our country. As Professor Kamola describes, the outrage we are seeing nationally about LGBTQ or anti-racist teaching is a part of an organized backlash. Koch-funded donors and right-wing think tanks have been building an entire ecosystem to fan the flames of this conservative take-back of our country. Despite what mainstream media is telling us, the moral panic we are witnessing on social media feeds is not an organic occurrence. Rather, it is a political communication strategy invented by a man named Chris Rufo, who created the boogeyman of CRT as a means of taking over local school boards. This strategy capitalizes on telling white Christian parents our public education system is teaching white children, to feel guilty about racism. In doing so, the GOP is capitalizing on racial anxiety as a way to engage a base of highly active conservative voters. This is not about education. It's about political control. From book bans in Florida to anti-trans legislation in Texas, the GOP has designed an effective strategy for taking back political power at the local and state level. Under the guise of protecting students from racially incendiary and sexually explicit material, lawmakers are crafting laws that allow conservative parents to remove books and content from classrooms and library shelves. We must speak up and fight back. As Professor Kamola encourages us, these tactics are only effective as long as they are hidden. As involved citizens, we need to do our homework on the people behind these attacks. Organizations like the Heritage Foundation, Parents Defending Education, and Charlie Kirk's Turning Point are radicalizing mama bears to storm PTA and school board meetings and push out educators leading racial justice education. We cannot allow them to bully us or our education leaders. In upcoming episodes, I will be speaking directly to the educators and activists who have been the targets of these attacks to understand what are their experiences and how do we analyze them so that we can, as concerned parents, courageous educators, and involved citizens, do what we need to do to protect them. Frederick Douglass explained that liberation never comes easy. He said, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." Well, welcome to the struggle. Let's get to work. Just Talks is written and produced by yours truly, Allie Collins. I'm an educator, writer, organizer, and parent. I'm making this video so we can get educated and take action to protect our public education system and advance education justice. This podcast is free, but it's not free to make. If you would like to ensure that I keep producing more episodes, please visit my Patreon at patreon.com/Allie Collins Production. Support my guests by visiting the links in the description below, and please like and share this podcast video.